Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo info video, and today we're talking about De Kleine Wijnkoop's O Treffer Cinsaut 2021. Now if we translate the name O Treffer from Afrikaans directly into English, it means old hit, but perhaps a slightly better translation would be along the lines of old classic or golden oldie. And the name carries relevance on two fronts. First of all, because the vineyards from which the fruit was harvested for this wine were planted in 1954, so they've been around a while. Secondly, Cinsaut as a cultivar has a long and rich history in South Africa, and seemingly it has a fairly bright future too. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the block of vines from which this wine was made. Then we'll move on to what this wine actually tastes like in the glass. And thirdly, in the Geek Speak section of this video, I'm going to talk about the concept of third wave Cinsaut and why this is exciting for the world of wine at large. As I mentioned earlier, this particular block of vines was planted in 1954, and the fruit from these vines is also used by well-known winemaker Erika Obermeyer for her old vine Cinsaut. Significantly, this is a dry land farmed patch of vines, which means that they are never irrigated. Now, as we've learned from other videos, the two combinations of old vines and dry land farming are particularly good for Cinsaut. Mostly because as a cultivar, Cinsaut is more generous than Burger King on Black Friday, and anything that will slow down the production of leaves and fruit is a good thing. So when you have old vines that produce less and you restrict the access that these vines have to water, what you end up with is a more structured, more concentrated, more formidable Cinsaut. The last time I featured a De Kleine Wijn wine, I mentioned how winemaker Vineyard does crazy things like remove stems and then dry them out over a number of days and then add them back into the winemaking vat so that you get all the structure that comes from stem tannins, but you get none of those green herbal notes that sometimes ruin the beautiful fruit in a Cinsaut. Many of you asked, where is this wine? And so here it is. Vineyard first witnessed the technique of removing stems and drying them out when he was in the south of France in the Languedoc region. And so he brought that little trick home and put it to work in his own wines. Interestingly enough, it seems to be a trend that is growing in popularity with some of our more progressive winemakers. But stems aside, if you want to know how the wine was made, it was fermented in large open-top vats where there were punch downs roughly twice a day. Now, this in itself would have helped add to color and structure outside of the extra tannins added from the stems. And when it came to maturation, this wine was matured in concrete tanks for 3 months and then moved over into older 500-liter French barrels for the remaining 9 months. Now, when we get into the glass, it's no surprise that it presents as a little more formidable than many Cinsauts you might be used to. On the nose, there are those telltale red berry notes of cherry and raspberry, but then there's this added really interesting citrus zest, as well as a kind of dried herbs wave that elevates the whole thing to another level of complexity. This is of course in contrast to the often more lightweight Cinsauts that might offer you a little bit of candy floss and some watermelon, but not really much else. Now when we take a sip and move on to the palate, that vibrant red fruit really holds center stage. And I use the term center stage quite deliberately because there are some delightfully firm tannins that act as a sort of floorboard to lift it up and keep the fruit in the limelight. So on the palate, there is the lovely interplay between the bright berry acidity from the cherry and raspberry, as well as the tannic structure that lifts everything and holds it in place. And this is exactly the sort of combination that one needs in order to have a Cinsaut be taken seriously. As I've mentioned elsewhere, Cinsaut has been grown and vinified in South Africa for over 120 years. And the grape's relationship with the winemakers of the country has gone through various phases. There was the first wave, which was way back when, immediately after phylloxera, when it was planted en masse in order to try and help the wine industry recover. Then, roughly 100 years later, it entered the second wave, where all of a sudden winemakers began noticing that South Africa had an increasingly large portion of old vine Cinsauts that began producing more concentrated, more structured wines. In the second wave, it was also noted that many of these old vines were also dry land farmed and were producing rather formidable wines. Unfortunately, there was an epic occurrence of broken telephone between some of these pioneering winemakers doing great work with Cinsaut and the final wine drinking market. Up here we had the message that Cinsaut can be a fine wine if made properly from the right vines. But what trickled down was, hey, Cinsaut is trendy and you can drink it at a braai. The end result of this broken telephone debacle was a torrent of low-priced, forgettable Cinsaut wine that flooded the market.
For realsies.
Which in turn brings us to the notion of third wave Cinsaut. Now in part, The third wave is quite simply some of South Africa's finest winemakers like Eben Sadi or Adi Badenhorst doing what they've always done, which is find incredible parcels of old vine dry land farms and so, and producing absolutely epic premium wines for the world stage. These high quality Cinsauts in turn triggered the market's willingness to pay more for Cinsauts, which meant that other winemakers could invest more in these wines and produce a better quality Cinsaut. But there is a secondary factor as well, and that is that the Cape winelands are getting slowly drier, vintage after vintage, and appear to be getting hotter as well, which meant that many winemakers are beginning to look to cultivars that can handle this sort of climate change, and Cinsaut sits right at the top of that list. Because if the Cape winelands is not going to get any friendlier from a climatic perspective, South African wine in general needs to invest in cultivars that can not just survive in a tough, dry environment, but can thrive and continue to produce wines that are amongst the best in the world. Now, as we know, Cinsaut can do this. And in fact, the reason I'm excited about this third wave of Cinsaut is because our finest winemakers are already proving that South Africa can produce some of the best Cinsauts in the world. And nothing inspires fervor and passion in a young, up-and-coming winemaking generation than that promise of global glory. So the future of Cinsaut in South Africa looks very bright, not only because of its ability to handle our climate, but also because of the excitement of our young and brightest winemakers investing their time in making these wines to be world class. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoy this video, why not subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we make at least 6 videos each month that cover unusual cultivars, wine history, wine science, cellar mastery, and some of the dynamic rising wine stars coming out of the South African winelands.
Thank you.